A single phone call can unravel an entire facade. On New Year's Eve 2002, as a candlelight vigil was held for his missing pregnant wife, Scott Peterson told his unwitting girlfriend, Amber Frey, that he was watching fireworks near the Eiffel Tower. In reality, he stood in California amid worried family and friends. This chilling deception, a man weaving an alibi in real time, would thrust Amber into a harrowing dual role. The lover who became a key witness. How did an ordinary single mother find herself at the center of such a storm? And what really was happening behind Scott Peterson's calm demeanor and ever-shifting story? This documentary-style investigation dives deep into Amber Frey's psychological journey and her profound impact on Scott Peterson's alibi. It's a story of love and betrayal, denial and courage, and the emotional battle that unfolded behind the headlines. December 2002 in Modesto, California, a picture-perfect couple, Scott and Lacey Peterson, was about to become the focus of one of America's most gripping true crime cases. Lacey, 8 months pregnant, vanished on Christmas Eve, and the public watched with collective dread. At first, Scott Peterson appeared to be the distraught husband, but something felt off. His effect was strangely composed, his story almost too straightforward. Then came a bombshell. Another woman, Amber Frey, a 27-year-old single mother, revealed that she had been dating Scott Peterson in secret. This revelation turned a missing person investigation into a narrative of infidelity and suspicion overnight. In this documentary, we will explore why Amber made the choices she did, how she influenced the case's outcome, and the psychological undercurrents that defined each moment. We'll peel back the layers chapter by chapter, from the emotional discrepancies in Scott's behavior to Amber's own internal struggle and bravery, all with an investigative yet empathetic lens. By the end, we'll reflect on what this case taught us about denial, motive, and public perception in the pursuit of justice. Amber Frey did not enter this story expecting anything about her life to change in a permanent way. At the time Scott Peterson became part of her world, her concerns were ordinary and practical. Work, parenting, stability, the kind of problems that do not attract attention and do not require explanation. Nothing about her daily life suggested that she would one day be spoken about in connection with violence, investigation, or national attention. And that matters, because people behave differently when they believe their lives are small and private. Amber's decisions were shaped by routine. Routine creates comfort, and comfort lowers suspicion. Not because someone is careless, but because the brain does not remain alert when there is no perceived threat. Her environment did not train her to expect deception on a scale that would later define the case. She was not moving through the world anticipating that someone could construct an entire false identity around her. When Scott Peterson appeared in her life, he did not do so dramatically. There was no rush, no pressure, no emotional intensity that would have demanded caution. He appeared calm, present, consistent. Consistency is one of the strongest signals of safety the human mind recognizes. When someone shows up in predictable ways, the brain quietly categorizes them as low risk. This process happens without conscious thought. Scott's presentation fit neatly into that category. The story he told about himself did not raise alarms because it aligned with familiar social expectations. A man who had lost a spouse does not invite interrogation. He invites patience. He invites empathy. People instinctively adjust their behavior around grief, often without realizing it. Amber did not accept Scott's story because she lacked judgment. She accepted it because questioning it would have violated social norms about how grief is treated. Once that story was accepted, everything else was filtered through it. Emotional distance looked like sadness. Lack of availability looked like personal struggle. Reserve looked like restraint. None of those interpretations required effort. They were the easiest explanations available, and the mind almost always chooses the path of least resistance. As the relationship developed, emotional investment grew slowly. This is important because slow investment feels safe. It does not trigger alarm. It does not feel impulsive. By the time inconsistencies might have been noticeable, attachment already existed. Attachment changes perception. It encourages generosity in interpretation. It makes people assume complexity rather than deception. When people ask why doubts did not immediately turn into action, they overlook how attachment works. Once a connection feels real, the brain resists information that threatens it. Not because the truth is unwanted, but because the consequences of that truth feel destabilizing. Accepting that Scott was lying would not simply mean acknowledging deception. It would mean confronting the realization that her own understanding of her life had been wrong. That kind of realization carries emotional weight. It challenges self-trust. It introduces shame. It creates internal conflict. People do not rush toward that kind of discomfort. They pause. They reconsider. They wait for clarity that does not immediately arrive. This waiting is often misinterpreted as avoidance. But psychologically, it is negotiation. The mind is trying to reconcile two competing realities without destroying the sense of self. Amber was not choosing between truth and silence. She was trying to understand which version of reality she was living in. At this stage, there was no reason for her to believe she was adjacent to danger. The possibility of violence did not exist in her frame of reference. What she perceived was potential betrayal, not threat. And betrayal produces confusion, not urgency. Urgency only emerges when harm is anticipated. Without that anticipation, time stretches. Decisions slow. Meaning is processed internally before it becomes external. Her behavior during this period reflects that psychological state. Not calculation, not strategy, but uncertainty. This is the context that must be understood before evaluating anything that came later. Because when a person is suddenly placed inside a criminal narrative, their earlier actions are often reinterpreted through the lens of outcome. But outcome does not explain process. Process explains behavior. Amber's process began in a life that felt ordinary, predictable, and safe. Her reactions were shaped by that assumption. And assumptions, once formed, are not abandoned easily. Understanding this does not resolve every question about her role. It does not remove complexity. It does not excuse later contradictions, but it establishes something essential. She did not begin this story aware of its destination. And people who do not see danger do not behave as if danger exists. They behave as if they are living normal lives. That is where Amber Frey started. Once a belief settles into place, it does not remain neutral. It begins to organize behavior. This is the point where Amber Frey's experience moves beyond first impressions and into something more structurally important. The moment when belief quietly becomes commitment. Not commitment in the dramatic sense. Not declarations or promises. But the kind of commitment that forms when a story about another person becomes integrated into daily thinking. By the time Scott Peterson had been part of Amber's life for a while, his presence no longer required conscious evaluation. He was simply there, familiar, accounted for, and familiarity changes how people listen. When someone is new, every detail is processed carefully. Tone, timing, explanations, all of it is weighed. But once someone becomes familiar, the brain shifts into efficiency mode. It stops analyzing and starts assuming. Assumption is not laziness. It is neurological economy. The mind cannot afford to scrutinize everyone equally. It allocates attention based on perceived risk. Scott did not feel risky. He did not behave erratically. He did not display emotional volatility. He did not demand constant reassurance. In fact, he did something more disarming. He appeared emotionally contained. Emotional containment is often misread as maturity. When someone does not overshare, does not react intensely, and does not seem reactive, they are frequently perceived as stable. Amber likely experienced Scott as someone who did not create emotional chaos. And people who do not create chaos are trusted. As time passed, the relationship took on a shape. Not necessarily a defined future, but a recognizable pattern. Communication rhythms, expectations, Predictability. Once patterns exist, people stop questioning them. This is where belief transitions into investment. Because now, questioning the story would not just mean doubting Scott. It would mean destabilizing a routine that had already settled into her life. Human beings are deeply resistant to destabilizing routines unless forced to. Even when something feels slightly off, the brain prefers small internal adjustments over large external disruptions. So instead of asking, "Is this entire story false?" the mind asks, "How do I make sense of this part that feels unclear?" This is how doubt gets domesticated. It does not disappear. It gets contained. Small inconsistencies are absorbed rather than confronted. They are assigned benign explanations and placed at the edges of awareness. This process is especially strong when the relationship does not feel dangerous. Scott did not display traits that would have triggered fear. He did not threaten. He did not intimidate. He did not push boundaries aggressively. Without fear, there is no urgency. Urgency is the engine of action. Without it, people wait. As Amber's emotional involvement deepened, another psychological shift occurred. Responsibility began to emerge. Not responsibility for Scott's life, but responsibility for the relationship itself. Once a person feels responsible for maintaining emotional balance, they unconsciously start filtering their reactions. They avoid questions that might disrupt stability. They soften confrontations. They choose timing carefully. This is not manipulation. It is relational maintenance. People do this in healthy relationships all the time. But when one person is living dishonestly, relational maintenance inadvertently protects deception. At this stage, Amber's belief in Scott's story was no longer passive. It had become functional. It explained her choices. It justified her patience. It preserved her self-image. And once a belief serves that many purposes, it becomes difficult to relinquish, even when pressure begins to mount. The first serious fractures did not arrive as clear revelations. They arrived as discomfort, a feeling that something was misaligned, a sense that explanations were incomplete, moments that required extra interpretation. Discomfort is not the same as certainty, and most people do not act decisively on discomfort alone. They wait for confirmation. But confirmation is rarely delivered cleanly in deceptive situations. Instead, it arrives in fragments, partial truths, overlapping explanations. This creates a psychological fog. Inside that fog, the mind continues to operate on its existing framework, not because it is correct, but because it is already in place. It is important to understand that at this point, Amber was not ignoring reality. She was negotiating with it. Negotiation looks like hesitation from the outside. Internally, it feels like problem solving. How do these details fit together? What am I missing? Am I misinterpreting this? These questions do not indicate denial. They indicate effort. Effort to reconcile reality without detonating identity. Because by now, the cost of being wrong had increased. Being wrong would mean more than emotional disappointment. It would mean public exposure, moral judgment, reframing one's own role in hindsight. That is a heavy psychological price. And when the price of being wrong rises, people become more cautious about declaring certainty. They seek more information. They delay decisions. They attempt to regain clarity before acting. This delay is often mistaken for passivity. In reality, it is a form of internal labor. Amber was trying to understand whether the inconsistencies she perceived were significant or situational. Was this deception or complexity? Was this dishonesty or emotional limitation? The human brain is wired to choose the explanation that preserves stability until stability becomes impossible. At this point in the timeline, stability still felt salvageable. Scott's behavior had not yet crossed into overt threat. His explanations, while strained, had not collapsed entirely. And because Amber was not operating with the knowledge of what would come later, she evaluated the situation based on what she knew then, not what the audience knows now. This distinction is critical. Hindsight compresses time. Real life stretches it. Decisions that seem obvious in retrospect often emerge slowly when lived forward. Amber's belief in Scott's story did not end abruptly. It eroded. An erosion is gradual. It does not announce itself. It does not demand immediate action. It weakens foundations quietly. This is where Chapter 2 ends psychologically, not with revelation, but with instability. The belief that once felt secure no longer holds its weight. The commitment that once felt manageable now feels uncertain. The routine that once felt safe begins to feel fragile. But fragility alone does not create action. It creates waiting. And waiting sets the stage for what comes next. Doubt and fear are not the same psychological state. Doubt asks questions. Fear changes behavior. For a long time, Amber Frey existed in doubt. She noticed inconsistencies, felt discomfort, and tried to reconcile what she was experiencing with what she believed to be true. But doubt alone does not trigger decisive action. Fear does. The shift from doubt to fear does not happen suddenly. It is not marked by a single realization or moment of clarity. Instead, it emerges when the mind stops asking, "Is something wrong?" and begins asking, "What happens if it is?" This transition is subtle but profound. At some point, Amber's discomfort stopped feeling abstract. It stopped being something that could be resolved internally. It began to feel like something external, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous. This is where psychology changes direction. When people feel doubt, they remain inwardly focused. They analyze their own thoughts, interpretations, and reactions. When fear appears, attention moves outward. The environment becomes something to monitor. Scott's behavior no longer felt like something that required interpretation. It began to feel like something that required awareness. Tone matters here. People often underestimate how much fear is communicated through emotional tone rather than words. Scott did not need to say anything explicitly alarming. Subtle shifts were enough. The way he spoke, the way he avoided certain topics, the way explanations felt incomplete rather than unclear. These changes are difficult to articulate, but they register quickly at a neurological level. The brain is highly sensitive to inconsistencies in social behavior, especially once emotional trust has already been established. What had once felt like reserve now felt like concealment. That distinction is critical. Reserve feels respectful. Concealment feels intentional. Once behavior is interpreted as intentional, fear begins to form. At this stage, Amber was no longer trying to protect the relationship. She was trying to protect herself. This is an important psychological turning point. Self-protection activates a different cognitive system. The brain becomes less concerned with harmony and more concerned with risk. It begins to gather information not to resolve confusion, but to establish boundaries. People often misinterpret this phase as coldness or calculation. In reality, it is vigilance. Vigilance does not announce itself emotionally. It does not feel dramatic. It feels quiet, focused, and controlled. Amber's attention likely sharpened. Conversations that once flowed easily were now observed. Details that would have been ignored before were now noted. This shift does not require conscious intent. The brain does it automatically when it senses threat. Fear also reorganizes time perception. When fear emerges, the present moment becomes heavier. Decisions feel more consequential. The future feels uncertain in a way that demands preparation. This is when people begin to document, remember, and mentally archive interactions. Not because they plan to use them, but because the brain is preparing for the possibility that they might be needed. At this stage, Amber was not acting as a witness. She was acting as someone whose sense of safety had been disrupted. Safety is not just physical. It is emotional, social, and psychological. When someone realizes that a person they trusted may be fundamentally different from who they believed, the ground beneath them shifts. The world becomes less predictable, and unpredictability is one of the strongest generators of fear. Scott's behavior did not need to escalate dramatically for this fear to exist. It only needed to feel opaque. Opaque people are difficult to assess. Difficult to assess means difficult to trust. And when trust collapses, fear fills the gap. At this point, Amber's internal questions likely changed. She was no longer asking whether Scott was telling the truth. She was asking what his untruthfulness might imply. Implication is where fear lives, because implication introduces unknown consequences. People can tolerate being lied to. They struggle to tolerate not knowing what a lie is protecting. This uncertainty is psychologically destabilizing. Once fear enters, action becomes more likely, but not impulsive. Fear does not always produce immediate confrontation. More often, it produces caution. Caution looks like distance, like listening more than speaking, like avoiding unnecessary conflict. These behaviors are sometimes misinterpreted as manipulation, but in reality, they are protective strategies. Amber was no longer engaging emotionally. She was monitoring. Monitoring is a sign that fear has replaced doubt. This shift also changes how people remember events. Memory becomes more precise. Emotional details become sharper. The mind begins to track sequences rather than impressions. This is not deliberate. It is adaptive. The brain is preparing to make sense of a situation that feels unstable. Another important change occurs here. Fear reduces self-blame. During doubt, people often blame themselves. They question their judgment. They wonder what they missed. Fear externalizes responsibility. Once someone feels threatened, the focus moves away from personal error and toward situational risk. This transition is psychologically necessary for action to occur. As long as someone believes confusion is their fault, they hesitate. When they believe risk exists outside of them, they move. At this stage, Amber's behavior likely became more measured. Not because she was calculating, but because fear slows people down. Fear makes people careful. Carefulness is not hesitation. It is preparation. Preparation does not always look decisive from the outside, but internally, it represents a shift toward survival-oriented thinking. This is also the moment when people begin to consider external support. Not because they want intervention, but because they recognize limits. Recognizing limits is a sign of psychological clarity. It means the mind has accepted that the situation can no longer be managed internally. But acceptance does not require panic. It requires realism. Amber was moving toward realism. Not certainty, not accusation, but acknowledgement that something about Scott was no longer safe to ignore. This is where Chapter 3 ends psychologically. Not with confrontation, not with exposure, but with fear quietly replacing doubt. Once fear exists, behavior changes permanently, and nothing that follows can be understood without recognizing this shift. Fear does not immediately demand action. It demands structure. When fear replaces doubt, the mind looks for something stable to hold on to. Something reliable. Something that does not shift with emotion or interpretation. That is where information becomes important. Not information as truth, and not information as proof, but information as safety. At this stage, Amber Frey was no longer trying to understand Scott emotionally. She was trying to understand him functionally. This is a critical psychological shift. When people feel emotionally threatened, they stop asking who someone is and start asking how someone behaves. Behavior is measurable. Tone can be tracked. Patterns can be noticed. This is not investigative thinking. It is self-preservation. The human brain, when faced with uncertainty, seeks anchors. Facts, even incomplete ones, feel safer than impressions. Amber's attention likely moved away from emotional meaning and toward consistency. What did Scott say yesterday? What did he say today? What changes? What stays the same? These questions emerge naturally when fear enters the picture. And once the mind begins tracking behavior, memory changes. Moments are no longer absorbed and forgotten. They are retained, not because the person plans to use them, but because the brain senses they may matter later. This is how documentation begins psychologically, not as evidence, as grounding. People often misunderstand why someone starts recording, noting, or remembering details more carefully. They assume intention, strategy, foresight, but most of the time, It is a response to instability. When reality feels unreliable, the mind tries to create something solid. Information becomes that solidity. Amber's shift toward gathering information did not require conscious decision-making. It followed naturally from fear. Fear narrows attention. Narrows attention increases focus. Focus sharpens memory. This process happens without instruction. It is the same instinct that makes people remember license plates after accidents or details after arguments. The brain prepares itself for possible future explanation. Another important change occurs here. Emotional distance increases. This is not withdrawal. It is containment. Amber was no longer sharing freely. She was observing. Observation is not passive. It is active restraint. Restraint allows space for clarity. Once someone begins observing rather than participating emotionally, the balance of power shifts. Not outwardly, but internally. The observer regains a sense of agency. Agency is essential when fear is present. Without agency, fear becomes panic. With agency, fear becomes control. Amber's behavior at this stage reflects an attempt to regain control over a situation that had begun to feel unpredictable. Information offered a way to do that. It allowed her to replace emotional reliance with cognitive structure. Instead of asking herself how she felt about Scott, she could track what he did. Instead of questioning her own judgment, she could assess patterns. Patterns are less personal than feelings. They reduce self-blame. This is important because fear combined with self-blame paralyzes people. Fear combined with clarity mobilizes them. As Amber began paying attention to details, inconsistencies became more visible. Not dramatic contradictions, subtle ones. Shifts in phrasing, timing that didn't align, explanations that required effort to maintain. These are the kinds of discrepancies that only stand out once someone is no longer emotionally immersed. When people are emotionally involved, they smooth over gaps. When they are observing, gaps stand out on their own. This change in perception does not make someone suddenly confident. It makes them cautious. Caution does not seek confrontation. It seeks confirmation. Amber was not yet acting against Scott. She was acting for herself. This distinction is essential. Nothing about this phase suggests revenge, anger, or moral positioning. Those emotions come later, if at all. At this point, the goal was internal stability. Another psychological factor begins to emerge here: anticipation. Fear is forward-looking. Once fear exists, the brain begins to imagine scenarios. Not vividly, but abstractly. What could happen if this escalates? What might I need to explain? What might I need to remember? This anticipation does not feel dramatic. It feels practical. And practical thinking leads people to preserve information. Not to accuse, but to prepare. Amber's movement toward recording conversations fits cleanly into this framework. Recording is often framed as bravery or betrayal. Psychologically, it is neither. It is containment. It allows a person to offload responsibility for remembering. It removes ambiguity. It creates distance between experience and interpretation. Most importantly, it provides reassurance. Reassurance that reality can be revisited. Reassurance that memory will not be questioned. Reassurance that the person is no longer alone with uncertainty. This reassurance matters more than any legal outcome at this stage, because fear isolates, and isolation amplifies distress. Information reconnects the person to something solid. Another change occurs once recording begins. Emotional investment decreases sharply, not because of anger, but because attention has shifted. The mind cannot fully observe and fully attach at the same time. One replaces the other. Amber's interactions with Scott likely became more measured, less spontaneous. Not because she was acting, but because fear suppresses emotional reflex. This suppression is adaptive. It allows people to remain composed when they do not feel safe. From the outside, this composure can be misinterpreted. It can look calculated or detached. Internally, it feels controlled. Control is what fear seeks. As this phase progresses, Amber's role shifts again, not into a witness and not into an accuser, but into a boundary setter. Boundaries are not always spoken. Sometimes they exist internally. She was no longer granting Scott emotional access. She was no longer filling gaps with empathy. She was allowing silence to exist. Silence, in this context, is not avoidance. It is space. Space allows behavior to reveal itself. People who are deceptive often struggle in silence. They fill it with explanation, with reassurance, with narrative. Observers notice this, and noticing reinforces fear, but also clarity. At this stage, Amber was no longer confused. She was unsettled, and unsettled people prepare. Preparation does not always look decisive, but it changes direction. Once someone begins preparing, the situation can no longer return to its previous state. Even if no action is taken immediately, the internal shift is permanent. This is the quiet point of no return. Nothing explosive has happened yet. No accusations, no exposure, no public consequence. But psychologically, the relationship has ended. What remains is process. Process takes time, and that time is shaped by fear, caution, and the need for safety. This is where Chapter 4 ends. Not with confrontation, not with disclosure, but with information replacing emotion as the primary tool for stability. From here, action becomes possible, not inevitable, but available. There comes a point when understanding a situation is no longer enough. Up until this moment, Amber Frey had been managing everything internally. She had observed, noticed inconsistencies, created emotional distance, and gathered information in ways that helped her regain a sense of control. That internal control mattered. It allowed her to function. It kept the situation contained, but containment has limits. Eventually, holding everything alone begins to feel heavier than releasing it. Not because clarity has arrived, but because the strain of maintaining silence starts to outweigh the fear of exposure. This is where the threshold appears. Crossing it does not mean certainty. It means acknowledgement, an acceptance that the situation cannot remain private without consequence. For Amber, this realization did not arrive dramatically. There was no sudden moral awakening or decisive moment of confidence. Instead, it developed quietly through accumulation. The weight of what she knew had begun to interfere with her ability to live normally. The effort required to stay composed was increasing. The sense of isolation was becoming more pronounced. Silence, which once felt protective, now felt unstable. That shift is psychologically significant. When silence begins to feel unsafe, the mind starts looking for alternatives, not solutions, but relief. Relief does not mean resolution. It means reducing the burden of carrying everything alone. At this stage, Amber was facing a reality many people encounter in high-stress situations. Whatever choice she made would change her life, but doing nothing would change it as well. The difference was that inaction no longer felt passive. It felt like participation. Not participation in wrongdoing, but participation in concealment. This is where ethics enters the psychological landscape. Not as a clear rulebook, but as pressure. A pressure that does not accuse, but persists. It is important to understand that ethical pressure does not always point clearly toward action. Often, it creates hesitation. People feel the weight of responsibility before they feel clarity about what to do with it. Amber was not choosing between good and bad options. She was choosing between difficult ones. External involvement meant surrendering control. Once others were involved, she would no longer decide how events were interpreted. Her words, her timing, her decisions would be examined by people who did not share her internal experience. That loss of control is frightening, especially for someone who has already experienced deception. But internal management had reached its limit. The situation had outgrown her capacity to handle it alone. This realization does not remove fear. It reorganizes it. Fear shifts from what if I act to what if I don't. Not in the form of logical questions, but as persistent unease. A sense that staying silent was no longer neutral. This is often the moment people describe later as inevitability, even though it did not feel inevitable at the time. It felt unresolved. Amber's decision to cross the threshold was not about certainty. It was about acknowledgement that the situation now existed beyond her private life. Once that acknowledgement occurs, action becomes possible, even if it remains uncomfortable. Another important psychological change happens here. Responsibility becomes shared. Up until now, Amber had been the sole interpreter of events. Crossing the threshold meant allowing others to participate in that interpretation. This does not mean surrendering truth. It means surrendering ownership of the narrative. That is a difficult trade. People hesitate not because they want to hide information, but because they fear being misunderstood. Misunderstanding can feel as threatening as judgment. Amber likely knew that once she spoke, her role would be defined by others. Her intentions would be questioned. Her timing would be scrutinized. She could not control that. But she could no longer control the situation by staying silent either. This is where acceptance enters. Acceptance not of outcome, but of uncertainty. Once someone accepts that uncertainty is unavoidable, action becomes less paralyzing. Amber did not need to know how events would unfold. She only needed to accept that they would. This acceptance marks the true crossing of the threshold. From this point forward, the situation is no longer internal. It has entered a process. Processes move forward whether or not the individual feels ready. This shift also changes how people relate to their own past actions. Earlier hesitation is no longer viewed as indecision, but as part of progression. Not because memory is rewritten deliberately, but because meaning evolves once direction changes. Amber's crossing of the threshold did not transform her into a confident actor. It placed her inside a system with rules, expectations, and consequences beyond her control. That system would shape what came next. This chapter does not end with resolution or moral clarity. It ends with transition, a quiet but irreversible shift from private reckoning to public process, from internal management to external consequence. Once that shift occurs, nothing that follows can be understood without it. Once a situation enters an external process, it stops belonging to the individual who initiated it. This is the part of the story that is often misunderstood. From the outside, cooperation looks like empowerment. It looks like someone stepping forward, taking control, and choosing to participate. From the inside, cooperation feels very different. It feels like surrender. Amber Frey did not step into cooperation because she suddenly felt strong or confident. She stepped into it because the situation had moved beyond what she could manage privately. The moment she allowed others to become involved, the balance of control shifted permanently. Information that once existed only in her own mind was now subject to interpretation by people with different priorities, different frameworks, and different goals. That loss of control is immediate and irreversible. Once cooperation begins, nothing can be taken back. Words cannot be unsaid. Timing cannot be adjusted. Context cannot be fully explained in real time. This creates a new psychological pressure. Before, Amber had been managing fear internally. Now she had to manage perception. These are not the same thing. Managing fear is private. Managing perception is public. Public perception introduces judgment, even when no one intends harm. Questions become sharper. Details are revisited. Motives are examined. Even cooperation itself becomes something that is evaluated. This evaluation is unavoidable. When someone cooperates with authorities, they're no longer seen only as a person with information. They're seen as a participant in a system. That system has momentum. It moves according to procedure, not emotion. This is often where people experience disorientation. They expect cooperation to bring relief. Instead, it brings exposure. Amber's role began to narrow. She was no longer a person explaining her experience. She was becoming a source of information. Sources are not engaged emotionally. They are assessed. This shift can feel dehumanizing, even when handled professionally, because the system is not designed to validate feelings. It is designed to extract clarity. Extraction requires repetition, precision, and consistency. People are asked to recount events multiple times, often in different ways. Not because they are doubted, but because consistency is how systems operate. For someone already dealing with emotional strain, this process can feel invasive. Memory becomes something that is examined rather than trusted. Tone becomes something that is interpreted rather than felt. The individual begins to experience their own story as something external. This creates distance from the self. Distance can be protective, but can also feel alienating. Amber was no longer speaking only for herself. She was now speaking into a structure that would carry her words forward without her. That is a difficult adjustment. Another change occurs during cooperation: identity compression. Complex people become simplified. Nuance is lost. Internal conflict is flattened into timelines and summaries. This is not malicious. It is functional. Systems need clarity, not complexity. But for the person inside the system, this simplification can feel inaccurate. Parts of the experience that felt important internally may not be relevant externally. Fear, hesitation, uncertainty. These do not translate cleanly into official process. What remains are actions, statements, and dates. Amber's internal experience was richer than what could be captured. This mismatch can create frustration. People often feel misunderstood during cooperation, even when they are believed, because belief does not equal understanding. As cooperation continued, Amber's sense of agency likely fluctuated. At times, participation may have felt purposeful. At other times, it may have felt overwhelming. This inconsistency is normal. Cooperation is not a single decision. It is a series of moments. Each interaction reinforces the reality that the process is larger than the individual. Another psychological shift happens here. Responsibility disperses. Earlier, Amber carried the weight of deciding what to do. Now decisions were shared, guided, and sometimes made for her. This can bring relief, but it also removes autonomy. Autonomy is comforting, even when it is burdensome. Losing it can feel destabilizing. This is where many people experience a sense of regret. Not about acting, but about how irreversible the act was. Regret does not mean the decision was wrong. It means the cost is being felt. Amber's cooperation did not place her back in control. It placed her inside a machine that would continue to move whether she was emotionally prepared or not. As her role solidified, public attention followed. Public attention introduces another layer of loss. Privacy disappears. Personal history becomes public material. Motives are speculated on by people who have no access to internal experience. This scrutiny can feel violating. And yet, once cooperation begins, withdrawal is no longer an option. The system does not pause for discomfort. This is the paradox of cooperation. It is necessary, it is costly, and it is not designed to protect the person who provides it. Amber's participation would soon be framed by others as decisive, brave, or instrumental. Those labels simplify reality. From the inside, cooperation felt less like action and more like endurance. Endurance of repetition. Endurance of exposure. Endurance of being interpreted. This chapter does not end with empowerment. It ends with displacement. Amber had crossed from private individual into public role. That role would now shape how her actions were seen, remembered, and judged, often independently of her intent. Once cooperation begins, identity is no longer self-defined. It is assigned, and assigned identities are difficult to escape. There is a moment when a person realizes that events are no longer unfolding around them, but through them. This is what it means to become the story. For Amber Frey, this shift did not happen all at once. It emerged gradually, as her name stopped being attached to a private situation and began circulating independently of her control. At first, attention feels indirect. People ask questions. Interest increases. Conversations change tone. But eventually, something more permanent takes shape. The narrative detaches. Once detached, it develops a life of its own. Amber was no longer just someone involved in a sequence of events. She was becoming a symbol within a larger explanation. Her role was no longer flexible. It was being defined externally. This is a psychologically disorienting experience. When identity is formed internally, it evolves slowly and privately. When identity is formed publicly, it solidifies quickly and without nuance. Public narratives do not tolerate complexity well. They require coherence. They require clear roles. They reduce ambiguity so the story can move forward. Amber's experience was complex. The story that formed around her was not. She was framed as a specific figure within the case, and once that framing took hold, it shaped how every action was interpreted. Words spoken earlier were recontextualized. Hesitations were re-examined. Timing was reassessed. Meaning was applied retroactively. This retroactive meaning does not ask how something felt at the time. It asks how it fits now. For the person living inside the narrative, this can feel deeply alienating. Amber's internal reality had been gradual, uncertain, and emotionally layered. The public version of events was streamlined and decisive. That contrast creates a sense of loss. Not loss of reputation necessarily, but loss of ownership over one's own experience. Once a story becomes public, it is no longer shaped by intention. It is shaped by interpretation. Interpretation follows patterns. People look for motivation. They look for agency. They look for clarity. Ambiguity is uncomfortable for audiences. They prefer certainty. This preference affects how individuals are portrayed. Amber's actions were no longer seen as responses to evolving understanding. They were seen as steps within a presumed trajectory. This reframing can make ordinary human behavior appear strategic or calculated, even when it was not experienced that way internally. Becoming the story also changes how a person remembers their own past. When memories are repeatedly described, questioned, and reframed by others, they begin to lose their original texture. Not because the person forgets, but because repetition alters emphasis. Certain moments become central. Others fade. What was once lived as a continuous experience becomes segmented into important and irrelevant parts. This segmentation is imposed, not chosen. Amber's identity within the case began to harden. She was no longer seen as someone navigating uncertainty. She was seen as someone who had played a role. Roles imply intention. This can be difficult to reconcile with internal memory, which often feels reactive rather than intentional. Another psychological effect emerges here: self-monitoring. Once someone becomes aware that everything they say may be interpreted publicly, they begin to monitor themselves more closely. Speech becomes cautious. Emotion becomes measured. Spontaneity diminishes. This is not deception. It is adaptation. Public visibility changes how people protect themselves. Amber was now living in a space where her actions no longer belonged solely to her. They were part of a broader explanation of events that extended beyond her personal life. This creates a sense of distance from oneself. The individual begins to feel like a representative rather than a person. That distance can be protective in some ways, but it also creates emotional numbness. Feeling too much becomes risky when feelings can be misinterpreted. So people regulate. They simplify their own reactions to avoid complication. This simplification feeds back into the narrative. Calmness is interpreted as composure. Restraint is interpreted as certainty. Silence is interpreted as intention. Very little space exists for uncertainty once the story has solidified. Amber's experience was no longer unfolding in real time. It was being retold, summarized, and contextualized. She had become a fixed element in a moving structure. At this stage, agency feels limited. Not because action is impossible, but because actions no longer carry the same meaning they once did. Earlier, choices were personal. Now, they were symbolic. Symbolic actions invite scrutiny. Every appearance, every statement, every absence is read for significance. This constant interpretation can be exhausting. It creates a feeling of being watched, even when one is alone. Becoming the story also alters how responsibility is perceived. Responsibility is no longer just about what one does. It becomes about what others believe one represents. This burden is heavy and is rarely acknowledged. Amber did not choose to become a symbol. She became one because the case required clarity, and clarity requires figures. By this point, returning to anonymity was no longer possible. Even if she withdrew entirely, the narrative would continue without her. This realization is often accompanied by resignation. Not resignation to guilt or blame, but resignation to permanence. Some experiences do not end. They settle. This chapter ends at that point of settling. Amber had become part of a public story that would outlive the private experience that created it. From here on, the question was no longer how events unfolded, but how they would be remembered. Memory does not remain static once an experience ends. It changes shape, not because people intend to alter it, but because memory is influenced by context, repetition, and interpretation. Once events are discussed publicly, memory is no longer reinforced privately. It is reinforced socially. For Amber Frey, memory was no longer something she held alone. It was something revisited, questioned, summarized, and reinterpreted by others. This process alters emphasis. Moments that once felt peripheral become central. Details that once felt unclear become definitive. Emotions that once felt mixed become streamlined. This does not mean memory becomes false. It becomes organized. Organization requires selecting what matters. Public narratives encourage certain selections over others. The parts of Amber's experience that aligned with the broader case were preserved. The parts that did not were gradually excluded. This selective reinforcement changes how motive is understood. Motive, when experienced in real time, is often diffuse. People act based on partial understanding, emotional pressure, and evolving perception. Rarely does a single motive drive behavior from beginning to end. But once events are viewed in retrospect, motive is often compressed. Complex internal states are reduced to singular explanations. This compression is not intentional distortion. It is narrative efficiency. Stories require coherence. Coherence requires simplification. Amber's actions were increasingly explained through a single lens: contribution to the case. Earlier uncertainty was reframed as restraint. Earlier hesitation was reframed as deliberation. Earlier fear was reframed as resolve. These interpretations made sense within the story that had formed, even if they did not fully reflect lived experience. Over time, hearing one's own actions described in consistent ways can influence self-perception. People begin to recognize themselves through description rather than memory. This is a subtle psychological shift. The internal question changes from "what did I experience?" to "how is my experience understood?" That shift matters, because once understanding becomes externalized, identity stabilizes around it. Amber's motives, as discussed publicly, became fixed. They were no longer open to revision or nuance. This can create distance between internal experience and public identity. Distance is not always painful, but it is rarely neutral. It requires adjustment. Another consequence of retrospective framing is moral alignment. As narratives solidify, actions are positioned within moral categories: helpful, harmful, necessary, delayed. These categories impose judgment without context. They do not ask how decisions felt in the moment. They ask how they contributed to outcome. Outcome-focused interpretation overlooks process, but process is where psychological truth lives. Amber's process involved confusion, fear, adaptation, and gradual clarity. The narrative emphasized effect rather than evolution. This difference shapes how motive is perceived. Motive becomes intentional rather than responsive. Intentionality implies foresight. Foresight implies control. But much of Amber's experience unfolded without either. The longer time passes, the more memory adapts to dominant interpretation. This does not mean Amber lost access to her own truth. It means that truth coexisted with a public version that carried more social weight. When public interpretation outweighs private memory, people often stop correcting it. Not because it is accurate, but because correction feels futile. Once a narrative is widely accepted, nuance feels like disruption. Disruption invites skepticism. Skepticism invites further scrutiny. Many people choose silence rather than perpetual explanation. Silence then becomes part of the narrative. It is interpreted as acceptance, or certainty, or finality. In reality, it is often exhaustion. Another effect of retrospective meaning is emotional stabilization. As time passes, emotional intensity dulls. Fear recedes. Shock fades. What remains is a settled interpretation. This settling can feel like peace, even if it lacks precision. Amber's later reflections were shaped by this settled state. Her explanations became clearer, not because the past had become simpler, but because the present required coherence. People are expected to explain their actions consistently. Inconsistency invites suspicion, so consistency becomes adaptive. This adaptive consistency can be mistaken for certainty. But certainty is often constructed after the fact. It is not evidence of original clarity. It is evidence of integration. Amber had integrated her experience into a stable self-narrative. That narrative allowed her to move forward, but it also fixed her role. Once a role is fixed, motive becomes assumed. Assumed motives are rarely revisited. This chapter does not question whether Amber acted appropriately. It examines how meaning is built after events conclude. Because meaning is not discovered, it is assembled, and the way it is assembled influences how people are remembered. Amber Frey's memory and motive were shaped not only by what she did, but by how those actions were retold over time. This does not make the story false. It makes it human. When a personal experience enters a legal system, it does not enter as a whole. It is filtered. Adversarial systems are not designed to explore complexity. They are designed to test claims. Their purpose is not to understand experience, but to determine which version of events withstands challenge. This difference matters. Truth as lived is layered. It includes uncertainty, emotion, partial understanding, and change over time. Truth, as examined within an adversarial framework, must be stable, defensible, and concise. Only certain parts survive that transition. For Amber Frey, cooperation meant that her experience was no longer interpreted through human context, but through legal relevance. What mattered was not how she arrived at her understanding, but what her understanding could establish. The system asked specific questions. What did she know? When did she know it? What did she do with that knowledge? Everything else receded into the background. This narrowing is structural, not personal. Legal systems require boundaries because they must operate within time, rules, and procedure. They cannot afford to explore internal evolution in depth. As a result, lived process is compressed into milestones. Moments are isolated from surrounding context. Emotional shifts are reduced to dates and actions. This compression creates clarity for the system, but it removes texture from the experience. Amber's gradual movement from trust to fear to action did not translate cleanly into that format. What survived were endpoints, statements, recordings, timelines. These elements were strong because they were concrete, but they did not tell the full story of how understanding developed. Another consequence of adversarial systems is polarization. Each side must position information in a way that supports its objective. This requires framing. Framing does not necessarily distort facts, but selects emphasis. Certain aspects of Amber's actions were highlighted because they supported a particular interpretation. Others were minimized because they complicated it. This is not manipulation. It is strategy. Strategy is built into adversarial processes. The system does not ask, what is most accurate? It asks, what is most persuasive within the rules? This distinction shapes outcomes. Amber's role became functionally defined by how her information could be used. She was not asked to explain her internal uncertainty in detail, because uncertainty weakens arguments. She was asked to provide consistency. Consistency strengthens cases. This expectation affects how people present themselves. When individuals are repeatedly asked to recount events in precise ways, they adapt their memory to fit that demand, not because they are dishonest, but because repetition reinforces structure. Over time, what is rehearsed becomes dominant. What is not rehearsed fades. This is how certain truths survive while others disappear. Amber's emotional journey mattered deeply to her. It mattered less to the system. The system required clarity, not evolution. This creates a gap between personal truth and institutional truth. That gap can be uncomfortable. People often feel that parts of their experience were left unacknowledged, even when their contribution was valued. Another limitation of adversarial systems is binary thinking. Claims are challenged or accepted. Statements are true or false. Credibility is granted or withheld. There is little room for partial understanding. Amber's experience involved partial understanding at multiple stages. She did not move from ignorance to knowledge in a single step. She moved gradually, adjusting as information accumulated. That gradualism does not fit neatly into adversarial logic. As a result, her role may appear more decisive in retrospect than it felt in reality. Decisiveness is easier to present than evolution. This presentation influences public perception. Audiences often mistake legal clarity for psychological clarity. They assume that because something was presented confidently, it was experienced confidently. That assumption is rarely correct. Adversarial systems reward certainty, even when certainty was constructed after the fact. This does not invalidate outcomes. It explains their shape. Amber's information contributed to a broader case that was already moving forward. Her role did not create the system's direction. It reinforced it. Once reinforcement occurs, the system absorbs the contribution and continues. The individual becomes part of a larger mechanism. At that point, personal experience matters less than functional impact. This transition can feel diminishing, not because the individual's role was insignificant, but because it was subsumed. Amber's truth existed in multiple forms. There was the truth she lived, the truth she shared, and the truth that survived adversarial testing. These truths overlapped, but they were not identical. Understanding this distinction is essential when evaluating her motives and actions. Motives do not survive adversarial systems intact. They are inferred, simplified, and assigned. The system does not ask why someone felt something. It asks whether something happened. This focus limits how motive can be represented. Amber's internal motivations were complex and evolving. The system required a stable narrative. So a stable narrative emerged. This narrative became the version most people remember, not because it was complete, but because it was functional. This chapter does not argue that the system failed. It explains what the system does. It does not preserve complexity. It selects for utility. And when utility becomes the measure of truth, certain aspects of human experience are inevitably left behind. This is the limit of truth within adversarial systems. They resolve cases. They do not resolve human experience. By the time the legal process concluded, Amber Frey's role had already solidified into something larger than her individual experience. She no longer existed in the public imagination as a person navigating uncertainty, fear, and gradual understanding. She existed as a reference point, a figure through which the case itself was interpreted. This is often what happens in complex cases. Individuals become symbols, not because they seek that role, but because stories require anchors. Amber became an anchor for meaning. Her involvement offered a way to explain Scott Peterson's behavior, his emotional detachment, and the contradictions in his public narrative. Through her, the case acquired psychological coherence. But representation is not the same as intention. What Amber represents is not what she set out to be. It is what her actions came to signify once placed inside a broader explanation. She represents the moment when the private and the public collide. Before her involvement was known, the case existed largely within a domestic frame. A missing wife, a concerned husband, unanswered questions. After her involvement became public, The case expanded into a story about deception, duplicity, and hidden lives. That expansion altered how everything else was perceived. Amber did not create that shift intentionally. It emerged from how her experience intersected with existing suspicions. This intersection is important. When personal experience aligns with broader doubt, it becomes magnified. Her actions took on meaning beyond their original context. This does not make her experience less real. It makes it more consequential. Amber also represents the limits of moral clarity in real human situations. From a distance, actions appear clear. From within them, they rarely are. Her choices were not made in isolation or with full information. They were made under emotional pressure, evolving understanding, and perceived risk. Yet once the case was resolved, those choices were often interpreted as if they had been made with foresight and intention. This retroactive clarity simplifies complexity. Amber's representation in the case suggests decisiveness, but her lived experience was gradual and uncertain. That contrast reveals something uncomfortable about how stories are told. We prefer clean arcs. We prefer identifiable turning points. We prefer figures who embody meaning. But real human behavior does not conform to those preferences. Amber represents the tension between lived reality and narrative necessity. She also represents how credibility is constructed. Her credibility was not inherent. It was established through consistency, documentation, and alignment with other evidence. Once established, it became fixed. Credibility, once fixed, shapes interpretation. Everything she said afterward was heard through the lens of trust. That trust influenced how jurors, the public, and commentators interpreted the case. But credibility is not the same as completeness. Being credible does not mean every aspect of experience is captured. It means the parts that are captured are believed. Amber's representation also highlights how gender expectations operate within public narratives. She was framed simultaneously as vulnerable and instrumental, as someone deceived and as someone who helped reveal deception. This dual framing allowed audiences to empathize with her while also assigning her responsibility within the story. That balance is rare. Often, women in similar roles are reduced to one dimension. Amber's representation avoided that reduction, but it did not escape simplification entirely. Her internal conflict remained largely unexplored. What she represents is not certainty, but transition. She stands at the point where private trust gave way to public scrutiny, at the point where personal fear became institutional process, at the point where lived experience was reshaped into legal narrative. Understanding her role in this way does not require judgment. It requires recognition of how meaning is produced. Amber did not control what she came to represent. Once her actions entered a larger explanatory structure, they acquired significance beyond her intent. This is not unique to her. It is a pattern that appears whenever individual lives intersect with public systems. But her case makes the pattern visible. She represents how truth moves through people. Not cleanly, not instantly, but through fear, adaptation, and gradual clarity. She represents the human cost of becoming evidence, not just in terms of privacy or exposure, but in terms of identity. Once someone becomes part of a public explanation, they no longer get to define themselves fully. Parts of their experience become communal property. That loss is rarely acknowledged, yet it is central to understanding her role. Amber Frey represents the reality that justice is carried by people, not abstractions. People who are imperfect, uncertain, and emotionally affected. Her story reminds us that truth does not arrive as a single moment of revelation. It arrives through accumulation, through hesitation, through adaptation, and through choices made without the benefit of hindsight. This chapter does not ask whether Amber did enough or too much. It asks what her presence in the case reveals about how we construct meaning from human behavior. And the answer is not comfortable. We turn people into symbols. We compress complexity. We favor coherence over process. Amber represents that tendency, not because she embodies it, but because she was placed within it. Scott Peterson's alibi did not collapse all at once. It weakened, and it weakened not only because of physical evidence or inconsistencies in time and place, but because of something more destabilizing: contradiction at the level of identity. An alibi is not simply an explanation of where someone was. It is an explanation of who they were being at a given moment. Scott Peterson's version of himself was central to his alibi. He presented as a worried husband, anchored to concern, routine, and normalcy. That presentation required emotional coherence. Amber Frey disrupted that coherence. Not intentionally, and not dramatically, but structurally. Her existence introduced an alternate version of Scott that could not be reconciled with the one he was presenting publicly. The problem was not that he was having an affair. The problem was that the emotional posture he displayed with Amber did not align with the emotional posture required by his alibi. Alibis rely on continuity. They require that a person's emotional life makes sense across contexts. Amber's experience revealed a disjunction. Scott's conversations with her were not oriented toward absence or uncertainty. They were oriented toward future planning, toward availability, toward life moving forward without interruption. That orientation matters. It is not proof of guilt, but it is evidence of psychological direction. People living in crisis behave differently from people anticipating continuity. Amber's account introduced evidence of psychological continuity at a moment when Scott claimed disruption. This contradiction eroded the credibility of his narrative. Importantly, this erosion did not depend on any single statement. It emerged through accumulation, repeated interactions, consistent tone, future-focused language. These elements suggested a person not psychologically preoccupied with loss. Alibis fail when they require compartmentalization that exceeds plausibility. Scott's story required him to be emotionally fractured, present in grief publicly while emotionally unburdened privately. Amber's account made that fracture visible. This visibility changed how the alibi was interpreted. It reframed Scott's actions not as isolated decisions, but as part of a broader pattern of disengagement. Amber did not provide an alternative timeline. She provided an alternative emotional reality. That reality forced the alibi to carry more weight than it could support. Another critical factor is timing. Amber's involvement surfaced after public suspicion had already begun to form. This timing intensified its impact. Had her story emerged earlier, it might have been processed as scandal. Emerging when it did, it functioned as confirmation. Confirmation does not need to be complete. It only needs to align. Her experience aligned with growing doubt. This alignment accelerated belief. Once belief accelerates, alibis are no longer examined neutrally. They are examined skeptically. Skepticism changes the burden. Instead of asking whether the alibi could be true, attention shifts to whether it withstands pressure. Amber's account applied pressure without needing to attack the alibi directly. It exposed emotional inconsistency rather than factual contradiction. That distinction is important. Factual contradictions can be debated. Emotional contradictions are harder to dismiss. They suggest intent rather than error. They imply orientation rather than mistake. Amber's presence reframed Scott's alibi as incomplete, not because it lacked details, but because it lacked psychological credibility. This reframing mattered deeply in how the case was understood. The alibi no longer existed as a standalone explanation. It existed in tension with an alternative portrayal of Scott's internal life. That tension could not be resolved by clarifying times or locations. It required explaining how both versions of Scott could coexist. That explanation was never convincing. Amber's role in this was not to disprove the alibi directly, but to destabilize the person who relied on it. Once a person's credibility erodes, their explanations follow. The alibi did not fail on logic alone. It failed because it no longer felt anchored to a believable psychological state. This is where Amber's impact was greatest. Not as a witness to events, but as a witness to mindset. Her account suggested a man already detached from the role his alibi depended on. Detached people can still tell the truth, but detachment makes truth harder to believe. This distinction shaped how jurors and the public processed Scott's explanations. They were no longer evaluating them in isolation. They were evaluating them against a competing emotional narrative. That narrative did not need to prove guilt. It only needed to make innocence harder to sustain. This is how alibis collapse in practice. Not through a single contradiction, but through loss of coherence. Amber Frey's involvement did not answer every question, but it changed which questions mattered. Where Scott became less important than who he was being. Once that shift occurred, the alibi no longer stood on neutral ground. It stood on contested identity. And contested identity rarely survives scrutiny. When a case reaches its conclusion, there's a strong temptation to stop thinking. A verdict is delivered. A narrative solidifies. The public moves on. Closure feels earned. But closure is not the same as understanding. Understanding requires staying with discomfort longer than we want to. The Scott Peterson case has been revisited countless times, often through arguments about evidence, timelines, and legal outcomes. But those discussions tend to orbit the surface. What sits beneath them is more difficult to confront. This case is not only about what happened to Lacey and Connor Peterson. It is about how truth moves through people, how narratives form under pressure, and how human psychology shapes justice in ways we rarely acknowledge. Amber Frey's role sits at the center of that complexity, not because she caused events and not because she controlled outcomes, but because her experience exposes something fragile about how we interpret human behavior. Her story reminds us that people do not act with complete information. They act with partial understanding. They adjust as reality shifts. They make decisions inside uncertainty, fear, and emotional constraint. From the outside, behavior looks sequential and intentional. From inside, it rarely is. One of the most uncomfortable lessons of this case is that moral clarity often arrives only after events have already unfolded. Looking backward, it is easy to say what should have happened sooner, what should have been obvious, what should have been done differently. But real life does not provide that vantage point. People move forward without knowing how their actions will later be interpreted. Amber Frey did not know what she would come to represent. Scott Peterson did not anticipate how his emotional detachment would be read. The system did not fully capture the human process that led to its conclusions. Each part of this story unfolded without foresight. That does not absolve responsibility, but it complicates judgment. Another lesson this case teaches is that truth is not a single object. There is factual truth, what can be verified. There is psychological truth, what was experienced internally. And there is narrative truth, what survives retelling. These truths overlap, but they are not identical. When cases become public, narrative truth often dominates. It is cleaner. It is easier to share. It fits the structure of explanation. But narrative truth trims away uncertainty. It removes hesitation. It replaces evolution with intent. Amber's experience shows how much gets lost in that trimming. Her actions, when placed inside a public story, appear deliberate and linear. But lived experience is not linear. It unfolds unevenly. Fear does not arrive all at once. Clarity does not arrive cleanly. Action does not always follow conviction. Understanding this does not weaken justice. It humanizes it. This case also challenges how we think about alibis. An alibi is not only a statement of location. It is a claim of continuity, that a person's internal and external lives align. Amber's involvement disrupted that alignment, not by disproving facts, but by exposing emotional inconsistency. This is uncomfortable because it forces us to confront how much we rely on emotional credibility when evaluating truth. We like to believe we judge facts objectively, but we do not. We judge people. We assess tone, orientation, and plausibility. We decide whether someone feels anchored to the life they claim to be living. This is not a flaw unique to jurors or the public. It is how human cognition works. Amber's role in the case highlights that reality. Her account did not prove everything, It changed what felt believable. That distinction matters. Finally, this case teaches us something about silence. Silence is often interpreted as guilt, calculation, or complicity. But silence can also be fear. It can be confusion. It can be the mind trying to reconcile incompatible realities. Amber's early silence has been questioned repeatedly. But silence does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside emotional context. People do not remain silent because they are hiding something. They remain silent because they are still trying to understand what they are holding. That understanding takes time, and time looks suspicious in hindsight. The Scott Peterson case will likely continue to be debated. Evidence will be re-examined. Arguments will resurface. Perspectives will shift. But Amber Frey's role offers something more enduring than debate. It offers a lens, a way to see how ordinary human psychology intersects with extraordinary events. A reminder that justice is not delivered by abstractions, but by people. People who hesitate. People who adapt. People who make decisions without knowing how those decisions will be remembered. When the story ends, what remains is not certainty. What remains is responsibility. To resist oversimplification, to question clean narratives, and to remember that behind every public role is a private process that never makes it fully into the record. Amber Frey's unknown motive may not be a hidden agenda. It may simply be human survival. And that possibility is far more unsettling than a clear answer. Because it suggests that in similar circumstances, most people would not act with clarity either. They would act as she did, gradually, imperfectly, under pressure, and only later would meaning be assigned. That is what this case ultimately reveals. Not who to blame, but how fragile certainty really is. If this analysis stayed with you, take a moment before moving on. Cases like this are often presented as finished stories, but understanding only deepens when we continue asking careful questions rather than accepting simple answers. If you value long-form discussions that slow things down and examine the psychology beneath the headlines, consider subscribing to this channel. New episodes here focus on the human processes behind well-known cases, not just what happened, but how people arrived there. You're also invited to share your perspective in the comments, not to argue conclusions, but to reflect on what stood out to you, what felt unresolved, or what changed the way you think about this case. And if you know someone who approaches true crime with patience and curiosity, feel free to share this video with them. Thank you for spending this time here.